Can you hear me, Sharon? Can you hear me?
I can't hear you, Matt.
You can't hear me? Wow. Am I on mute? Nice. Mike, can you hear me, Sharon?
I can't. There's no sound.
Isn't technical details wonderful? Can you check that you've still got your microphone on? Can you hear me now, Sharon?
Oh, there you are. I can hear you now.
Okay, much better. All right, I'll do without headphones. Hopefully you'll go. We're talking for about 20 minutes before the interview, and isn't it typical? The second you press the live button, hell opens up and everything goes wrong. Hopefully that's the last bit of technical issues we'll have for today. Sharon, it's so nice to see you. It's been years since I last saw you on the festival circuit. How's life going for you?
Everything's great, Matt. Thanks. Yeah. It's a rough life here. I even brought sunglasses just to I wanted to play the whole part and just be like, everything's great.
Yeah, well, you're sitting behind a swimming pool, so it definitely doesn't seem like life's going too hard at this moment.
I can't complain.
No. So since we don't have as much time as having a lot of the interviews, I know you've got some stuff you have to do very, very soon this afternoon. Let's plow straight into the interview and try and get some of your story. Try and work through it,
Yeah.
So why become a performer?
Yeah.
Your life seems to be completely wrapped around entertaining and performing and trying to say something when you're working. Did you want to do that from a small child? Was this a childhood dream that was slowly unraveling?
Well, when I grew up, I thought I wanted to go into medicine, which is funny because it's a completely different, field. But I was always interested in just physiology and things like that. I found that really interesting. But then I remember when I was about 15, I grew up in Toronto. When I was about 15, I went to the Second City in Toronto, which is like an improvisational theater. And a lot of big names came out of there, especially during the 70s. It was like John Belushi, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd. They all sort of came from there. And then when Saturday Night Live started, it was Lorne Michaels who sort of went and plucked a bunch of them and used them for their first cast. But the first time I ever saw anything like that, I was about 15, and I went to the Second City Theater. And I was just like, everything just kind of came into place. Like, I was like, that's exactly what I want to do. I can't, yeah.
Just before we talk a little bit more about the performing side, something that struck me when you said that, and it's one of my assumptions before I began the interview was, when you were young, did you have a will to help people? Was it just the physiognomy of, the biology of people's bodies, wanting to understand that, or was it a will to do something good in the world, a desire to be,
Oh, I don't think I was that, much of a philanthropist. I probably was just incredibly selfish and thought it was really cool. And I was like, oh, that would be awesome fun. And that looks great. Like that's probably more so where it was. And I don't know, where I still am fascinated with like medicine. I think I don't know, maybe it's just trying to figure out how all the parts work. I find that really interesting.
Yeah, and you studied psychology as well, so that was something to understand the psychological mechanics of a human being, right?
Yeah, although like it doesn't, I think it's a funny thing because having a degree, sometimes it's like it doesn't mean much. You could find, a lot of people that have really great insights about people and the human condition just from living and experiencing, and so. Yeah, but I did find it interesting to try and read about it and whatnot. Yeah.
And so you watched Saturday Night Live and you saw, because there was a huge Canadian influence in Saturday Night Live, right? You had Belushi, right. You had Aykroyd, Jim Carrey slightly after that. A lot of big names came from Canada. Mike Myers as well, if I'm correct on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Was another big Canadian.
Yeah, definitely. And there was a show that it was called SCTV, which was Second City Television, and that started probably that was in the early 80s, but it was like that was huge as well. In Canada, it was massive, and then it did actually go down to the United States and get aired down there. But I still watch that now, and some of the characters and the scenes in there is still some of the best, I think, sketch comedy that's ever been created. And it was a really young Marty Short, Catherine O'Hara, Andrea Martin, Eugene Levy. Like the names could go on, and it was just them. They were all performing at the Second City at that time, and then they got this opportunity to make a television show. And it's so Canadian because I think it was filmed in Edmonton, and it's just this real low budget Canadian sketch show. But it's still to this day, I think, one of the best sketch comedy shows that was ever created. And maybe, I don't know, would it read sometimes comedy can be cultural, so I don't know if maybe British people may or may not like it as much, but I still like some of the impersonations they did on there were incredible. John Candy would be on there, and they would do like they had Marty Short would do he had this one character named Jackie Roger Jr.'s, and it was sort of like this piss take of Sammy Davis Jr., but he was like this white guy who was really geeky, and then he'd do these dances, and then they'd have him on he'd fly up, but it was so ridiculous. And then they would make fun of Liberace, but their impersonations were so good. And so a lot of Canadians grew up from my age watching that. So that was another huge influence, but it all kind of stemmed back to the Second City. And the Second City, I think, started originally in Chicago because the University of Chicago didn't have a theater arts department. So it was a group of people created something called the Compass Players. And then that originally, that's how it started. And then it evolved. It became its own entity into the Second City. And then they had one in Chicago, and then they brought one to Toronto. So the two main ones were Chicago and Toronto. But it's definitely farmed out some amazing talent that have gone on to do incredible stuff. So
So seeing this stuff when you were 15, how did this change the direction in your life? Did you have a pivot moment from this?
Well, when I finished high school, I went straight and took all the improvisation classes I could at the Second City, and I was really pretty focused on that's what I wanted to do. And I was like, I want to do that. I want to get become a cast member. I want to get on the main stage there. And then there was this whole kind of goal of being eventually trying to do Saturday Night Live. But I think there was sort of a heyday for that. It felt like. Especially from Toronto. And I think in a way it was a timing thing where by the time I got there, it was mid 90s. And it was not that it didn't ever happen again, but it was rare that someone from Toronto Second City went further on to do anything. So I kind of was like, well, maybe I'd like to get study theater more, like study acting, and get kind of a general idea of different types of things you could do. So that's why I went back to school, and I did a degree in theater. And then in our last year, we did a whole year of clowning. And so we had these guys that are still quite active now, Mump and Smoot. They're Canadian clowns, and they came to our university in our last year. We did a whole year of clowning. And I really enjoyed that a lot. And it kind of, what I like is that it kind of gave you a whole different sort of belt of different tools that you could use as a performer. But yeah, I think that's kind of was I still think Second City was kind of the biggest influence on me at that time.
So Second City was the big drive, and then you kind of want to diversify, get a bit more kind of classical skills. You go to theater.
Yeah.
Then when you discover clowning, do you have any knowledge of the street at this time? Was the street?
No, it was really interesting because we did I went to school in Quebec, which is a province in Canada, and even though we had that's where Cirque du Soleil comes from, but it was really interesting how it wasn't really there were so many things that they could have done at our school. When I look back on it, how they could have exposed theater students to all sorts of different things, but it just was not on the radar of anybody. It's become much more quote unquote mainstream now. It feels like it anyways, but at that time it was sort of going to work with the circus was what, but I think that there could have been a lot more integration of, like, there's street performing, and and there's the circus and all these different things that you could work in, where a lot of the programs are sort of really just pushed into one, theater, and which is kind of, I think, exclusive. That's the one thing I didn't really necessarily like about it, looking back. But it wasn't until I moved out to Vancouver, and then I was working on Granville Island, which is this kind of, it's this one little part in Vancouver, and it has all these different shops and whatnot. And there's two main busking pitches there for circle shows. So I was working at a shop there, and that's where I saw street performing for the first time.
Well, just at this time, just to put you in a place of mind of where you are, where do you think your life's going at this moment when you go to Granville Island? What do you think you're going to do in your life? Have you given up on the idea of working in the theatre or in film?
It's a good question. At that point too, I remember I was just like, probably a bit lost, like trying to figure, like, okay, well, what do I do now? Like, I kind of got this degree that means nothing. It felt like that anyways. And, in order to pay rent in Vancouver, you have to work full time. But if you want to get into film and TV, you got to be available for auditions all the time during the day, which means that you can't work because you can't. So it's this real kind of like, how the hell how do you figure this out? I do remember feeling that way in my 20s. And I really enjoyed stand-up. I'd started sort of playing around with stand-up at that time. But there was, obviously there was no money to be making from it, especially when you start. So, yeah. And then so when I met street performers and I became friends with them and saw them, and I was kind of like, wow, you can do this thing that's really cool. You get to perform and you can travel all over the world. You're your own boss and you can financially support yourself with it and make your own hours. I was like, that's the most romantic job I've ever heard of. And like, to me, I was just like, it was the most incredible thing. I was like, wow. It just sort of felt like, wow, you beat the whole system,
Yeah, I can empathize definitely with the way of feeling that when I first watched street shows. What was the first show you watched? And how did you feel when you watched the show itself? Rather than all around the show, the feeling of watching the performance itself.
Yeah. Well, at the time on Granville Island, I remember Bill Ferguson was there, and Rick Lewis was there. I don't know if you ever, Rick Lewis I don't know that he did a lot of European circuits. He was definitely more North American, but he had this amazing show where he'd do a unicycle and then he'd steal the volunteers' watch during the whole mounting of it. But he'd do it in such a way that it wasn't until the very last part of the show was the reveal, where he's just like, hey, I got your watch. And I remember it's just all these cool little things where I remember just kind of going, oh, that's pretty cool. Bill Ferguson, I definitely remember, because he would have these massive shows, and then we'd go down to English Bay as well, which is a pitch in Vancouver. And Bill would just have these huge crowds at English Bay, and just seeing him just tell people to do stuff and they would do it. And I was like, just kind of in awe to have that much control over an audience was really impressive. And Byron was there. And I remember Dom Ferry came one summer. Dom was he was a performer. I think he's originally a New Zealander, but he lived in Australia for many years. Yeah. So he came. That's it. He used to work with Zip and Zap. Yeah. And then he started doing his own show, and he came to Vancouver one summer in the late 90s, and he was doing a whole Canadian circuit. And Vancouver used to have a comedy festival that happened on Granville Island, and they actually used to have a street performing element to it. And so Dom came for that. And that's the first time I think I saw anybody do following. And he would do the following. And English Bay was such a perfect place for following, because it has this footpath, and it's, spread out, and it's kind of like there's all sorts of random types of people down there. And I remember seeing him do following for the first time, and that kind of blew my mind. I was like, oh, that is really cool. So I definitely remember all of that. And I remember the one thing I really remember about Dom was that I wanted to figure out how to do a show, but I had no circus skill. And I was like, he was like, so why do you need to have circus skill in order to do a show? And I was kind of like, well, that's everyone else seems to have like these, does this or does that. And so he was really sweet. And we talked for quite a while about different things. And then I told him that I did this, did this whole year of clowning. And then I had this character that was based on, the clown was based on striptease, because at the time Demi Moore had just come out with the movie Striptease. And so my clown was a stripper, but she was kind of not always great at it. She was sort of like high status, low. She wanted to be high status, but then she'd be low status. And so it was always playing with that kind of, those kind of levels. And then he was like, why don't you just start with a 10-minute bit from that? And I was like, you can do that? Like, and he's like, you can do anything you want. And then he was sort of saying to me that he knew this one guy who went out with just an envelope. And he said he would do 40 minutes with just an envelope. And he's like, you don't need to have all these props. You don't need to do this. You don't need to do that. He's like, you just need to find something that's you and that you want to do and just go for it. And that was kind of like, yeah, he definitely lit the fire under me to kind of try something completely different from what I'd seen. So yeah, that's when I started. And then we were talking about it. And then it was Dom who came up with the idea of the Ladder of Men, because I was like playing with guys and because they're going, well, I could do this and I could put guys at different levels and whatnot. And it was Dom who was like, the Ladder of Men. And I was like, oh, that's really funny. So that's where that all kind of originated from at that point.
Well, isn't that interesting? You spent this time watching lots of other people's shows and thinking, how do I function in this? How do I find something for myself? And you had the experience that a lot of performers have at the beginning, where someone takes you a little bit under their wing and the wise old master imbibes knowledge upon you. What was your first performance like when you were trying this 10-minute bit?
It was hilarious, because what was interesting is that I had all the confidence and I was all talk and no trousers, kind of. Like I had no problem telling everyone I'm going to do something really great. I'd get a huge audience, but then I wouldn't know what to do with them. So it was like, yeah, I could do the crowd gathering, but then I really didn't have any substance to get after that.
How did you feel about that when you were in that position doing it? Were you excited? Were you nervous? Were you disheartened?
I do remember it was really exciting, but I also think, like, when I look back, especially when I first started, there was so little amount of in a way, awareness or conscious level. It was almost like just survival mechanism. Do you know what I mean? So it was kind of like, now there's so much more where, after you do it for a certain time, you kind of, hopefully, not always, but for the most part, you can kind of be present in the moment and react off different things and be sort of more grounded. Where I definitely think, like, when I first started, it was just like, you're just surviving, just trying to do anything, hoping that you're going to, figure it out.
And were you nervous at the enormity of the task of making people do a ladder of humanity, a ladder of men that you could climb up? Was that thing you were scared by, or did you throw yourself into that?
I don't know that I was scared of it, but maybe it helped and maybe it didn't, but I was probably more less empathic towards people not wanting to participate. So I was like, what do you mean you don't want to do this? I was like, what a fucking asshole. I'm like, get up here and get on your knees and lie down. Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? So, like, in a way, it was kind of like, maybe that was good for me because I was really ignorant. But then in another way, it took me a long time to kind of grow to be like, well, not everyone wants to do that. So how do you make it so that they want to be in it? And then not only that they want to be in it, that they're enjoying it, and then everyone else is enjoying it. So, I think it was
people will watch you torture another human being, but they might not necessarily like you very quickly.
We're so fucked up.
So when was the time where you really felt like it began to work?
I'm still waiting.
But there must have been a moment where you started doing it and playing with it and trying to figure it out. Was it just you were pushing it through from the beginning, and it's just that constant journey of trying to force something into the shape you want it to be in?
Yeah, I think I remember having a goal because I remember a lot of, I met some of the Australian performers that came to Vancouver. Like JP came, and one summer he lived in my closet in Vancouver. And Alakazam was there. And Cherie Vickers, she was British, but she had worked a lot, I think, in Australia. So there was like, and Dom obviously was there. And I just remember having this goal of wanting to go to Australia. And they were always like, yeah, Australia is really hard. And then I remember Al saying to me, like, everything you hear about Australia, believe it. It's like, it's really hard. But I remember just kind of having this, I was incredibly tenacious, where it was almost like I was, anytime somebody would like almost like set me up for failure, it was almost like I pushed harder. So I was determined that I was going to go to Australia and figure it out. And so that would have been 1999. I got a work visa, and I had like this little kit. And then I remember I went to Australia for the first time, and I just went to Sydney, and I was just tried to figure out how to work it there, and do like, I was working like Circular Quay, and then I got passed at Darling Harbour. And
what was your first day like when you worked?
I remember. Oh yeah, I remember going to Sydney, and I was staying. JP had this house with his wife at the time, Chris, and they had this place in Ashfield. And so I went and I stayed with them for a little bit out of Ashfield. And there was this person named Mez who had quit street. She had stopped street performing at that time, but we were about the same age, and she was living there. And she was kind of like the first person that I met. I mean, I went completely on my own. I knew JP, but that's about it. I didn't know really anybody. And, I was just like, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. And so I remember I went to this house, and I was there for a couple of days, and I met Mez because she was living there. And Mez and I completely connected as friends. And it was sort of like, I've met like a person who is like, just meeting, even having one person that you kind of go like, this person gets me, and I have the same sense of humor, and just having one friend almost was kind of like grounds you a little bit. So I totally remember that. And then
did you feel like this is just slightly off key, but did you feel like you had to prove yourself? Just saying off the thing you said earlier on about people trying to set you up for failure, and you felt like you had to overcome that every time, and then you pick yourself up and you go to Australia. You want to do this thing, which must have been, fucking scary. It's terrifying, the idea of going to a completely different country you've never been to before. Everyone's telling you the shows are hard. You're only beginning doing shows anyway. This, what's the drive, do you think, looking back now on that?
Probably just determined that I wasn't gonna, I think it was, I think there's probably part of me that is just generally, I don't know if it's just built in or what, I don't know, but it was like, it was determined that I was going to not give up. I don't know, like whether I was going to, in my mind, determined that I was going to, succeed or whatnot, but I was determined that I wasn't going to back down. I do definitely remember that, because I think, I don't know. And maybe in life, that's kind of part of who I am, where sometimes if someone sets up a challenge, or you're sort of, someone's like, oh, that's not going to work, or you can't do that, I'm just sort of like, I'll double down on it and just be like, well, fuck you. I'll prove you that I am going to do that, So, which sometimes isn't always good. It can also, get you into trouble. And sometimes it is good just to kind of go, yeah, okay, fine, you can have that. But definitely at that time, I was just very determined that I was going to go there and I was going to do it, because I knew that that I'd heard that it was like, everyone was like, yeah, it's really hard. You're in your first year of street performing. You're going to have a really hard time. And I was just like, fuck it, I'm going to do it. And
what were the other guys on pitch like? Were people supportive, or were people kind of a bit standoffish, new person on the pitch kind of thing?
Oh, I mean, it definitely depended where you were, and everybody was different, you know. I mean, then at that time, there were so few women doing it. Like there were most of the time. I mean, at the time, often the only other woman that would show up on pitch at the time would be probably Sam Rowe, who was she did a fire, and she at that time she was doing a night show with fire, and she was working like the laser shows at Darling Harbor. So she would only come in at nighttime, but she would always kill it. But during the day, I don't think Tamara was performing at that time, but Tamara was doing a lot of festival work at that time. So like on the pitches, most of the time, I would say like 99.9% of the time, it was like me and a bunch of fucking apes hanging out on pitch. Like, you know, but it was like, sorry, go ahead.
What kind of effect did that have? Was you being the only woman there a factor in your life? Did that make a big difference, do you think?
I'm sure it did. I think like, and the thing is too, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, yeah, it can have that, you know, it can make things difficult, but then on the other hand, it can also work in your favor. So because you know, you stand out and you're something different. And then also, like, I do remember like people like Lucky Rich, where a lot of people didn't, for whatever reason, they were very intimidated, or I don't know all the politics or whatnot, but you know, maybe because I was a girl, Lucky was actually really supportive and nice to me, you know, whether it was for whatever reasons. So on that hand, it was kind of like where you could see the other guys were kind of like, you know, they didn't necessarily get that similar treatment. So I don't know, like, I think there definitely were things that were probably extra challenging. I think the one thing was that what I like about now having more women around is that you just have more, and it doesn't mean just because someone is the same gender as you doesn't mean that you're going to be friends with them, doesn't mean that you're going to, but sometimes just having more women around, it does change the energy. I mean, I definitely can see that, to where when I saw more women coming in, especially on the pitches and in the festivals, the energy evened out a bit, where it definitely felt less, you know,
like a frat house?
Yeah, a little bit less about people talking about the money all the time, a little bit less of a pissing contest. Not that women can't be the same, but it definitely felt like just the energy would just change a gear, you know, and that's what I really enjoyed seeing, and just having other, you know, other people that you could kind of talk to about stuff that you couldn't necessarily talk to, you know, Bike Boy about, or, you know, or, you know, Lucky Rich. But yeah, so but I mean, I grew up with brothers, so I always, in the same way too, I wasn't necessarily intimidated by being, you know, the sort of one of the guys in that way. Not that there were times that I wasn't one of the guys, but it didn't necessarily always intimidate me either. So again, I think it was probably a double-edged sword.
There was things gained and things taken away from it. So how did your progression as a street performer evolve when you were in Australia?
What is interesting is that it made me more aggressive, I think, especially those first few years, because you just had to be, because I do remember, like, Canada's very soft comparatively, the audiences and the people, where Australia is like, you know, if there were any transitions in your show that were loose or that didn't, you know, people would just be gone. You know, it was like the walk-offs were just, so it was like, and blatant, like nobody felt bad. It's like, hey, you get fucked, and then they just turn around and leave. So it was like you had to just get so tight about your transitions, and you had to be like fearlessly, almost, yeah, it made me more aggressive, which wasn't necessarily always a positive thing, because then when I would come back to Canada, it was like people would just be a bit like, whoa, you know, like it's too much. But you kind of had to be that way in one part of the world to survive. So
When you say
I think,
aggressive, can you
yeah.
just elaborate on what you mean by that? I mean, you weren't punching people in the face in the shows, right?
No, just more assertive and trying to get people to stop, you know, and more assertive about, just way more assertive with everything, in the
And
way that you would get people to stop, the way that you would talk to people, the way that you would, you know, where Canada is much more passive. They're kind of like, they don't feel, they're like, oh, that's a bit too much for me, you know?
and so you'd be quite dominant with people, and you'd do harsh comedy and more personal comedy, more comedy which kind of
Well,
hit home.
yeah. And also I think because there were so few other, and not to say this is a gender thing, because there's lots of other guys that do it that have a different take on it, that they're not necessarily the alpha male that's really aggressive. But at the time, I didn't have a lot of other women to look to. And I mean, yeah, like I say, there at the first year or so, there was nothing for me to, so it was me just looking at other dudes and going, well, that's how they're making it work. So maybe that's what I have to do in order to make it work. Not really knowing that there could be another way.
Well, the interesting point you bring with that as well is that were you aping, like looking back now, maybe not consciously or maybe consciously at the time, aping other people's work? Were you becoming a curator of things you've seen in your own pieces?
Oh, for sure. And I think a lot of the times people do that when they're learning. It just happens, you know, where it's like, especially if you're trying to survive and you see all you see is these people are doing that and that's working. So I guess that's what I have to do in order to make it work. But then after a while, you know, that's when I came up with the Canada character after a couple of years, because I was just sort of like, there were parts of it that I was like, it's not really, there were parts, it would work kind of short term, but not long term. And so that's why I was kind of like, that's how I ended up coming up with the Canada character, because I was like, what if I started the show way softer? Like, what if I started the show on a way different status, like on a lower status, instead of coming in as this aggressive up here? What if I started down here? And how would that feel? How would that work? And, you know, and it definitely was like, you know, I had friends where I became friends with Amy Misbehave at this time, because I met her in Edinburgh, I think in like 2000. And Jackie Algie also became a really good friend of mine. And they were always making fun of me for being the passive aggressive Canadian and just being the, you know, just all the things that are in the Canada character now, they would make fun of me for, because Jackie was Australian and Amy's British. And so, yeah, they would just always make fun of me for it. And then I was like, well, what if I actually owned that more? Because in clowning, a lot of it was, you have that the clown, the character is sort of, there are truthful parts of you and your personality just kind of amplified in a lot of ways. So that one character that was, you know, the Tallulah was based on that clown that was part of my personality amplified. But that was definitely one part of my personality that was more the higher status one. But there's this other part as well that is sort of the Sharon from Canada, which I was like, well, what if I had both of those sides of me amplified and started with one and ended with one, and then some, like, what if I tried that? And that's definitely, I think, when things shifted in where I think my show definitely shifted creatively, because then it felt like I was really onto something, and I felt like, oh, this is actually working. Now this kind of makes sense, where this one character, it makes sense now that I'm going into that. Like, I had a reason for coming out and being that way. So, yeah.
And what's quite interesting is it seems that you took the two approaches of this more slight, more gentle Canadian crowd build, and this fucking harsh Australian brutalizing to keep focus.
Yeah.
And they both got woven into a one piece, you know.
Yeah.
When you have both of those elements. What were you doing before you created the Sharon from Canada character? and then the big kind of dominate, powerful character. What
Yeah,
was
well, that was the
show
thing.
before?
Yeah, well, that was the thing. I would just go out. Like, that's why I would just like go out with a fucking whip and just be like, get down, you fucking piece of shit. You get over here and do this. So like people like, whoa. But like it would go great. Like in Australia, some people loved it, you know, and in Europe, people were just like, they got off on it. But then, you know, you can't do that everywhere. And then it was like a certain festivals. So like, you can't fucking do that here. Like, it's just too much, you know? So it was like, that's really where I was like, okay, I got to figure out some sort of reason of why am I going there? You know, what's the I hate using these acting terms, but it's like, what was the motivation for me to want to get to that level of being that domineering, you know? So that's why I think I definitely was feeling after a while where I was like, it's not always working coming out on way up here. Because when you start up here, there's really nowhere to go. You know, like you can go down, but it's much harder to start up and go down. Like it's so when you come out and you're up here, you can't really go any further. So it kind of leaves you shortchange yourself in a way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
that's how I looked at it.
Well, also what's quite interesting is, I assume this is the truth, that festivals would go, oh, you can't be doing that here. But then when that's woven into a more obviously and more upfront theatrical piece where you're obviously playing characters, I assume that problem doesn't exist in the festivals anymore. People are quite welcome to you having this character.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that it didn't exist anymore, but it gave it a reason. So, like, for instance, but I mean, there were, again, that's where the double-edged sword comes in, because even though they would have a lot of men would be at festivals that could start out aggressive and be aggressive during the whole thing, but it was never seen as, oh, that's too much. But I genuinely believe as a female, and then as a performer, and then on the street, the lines are, you have to walk these. Yeah, there was a lot of figuring out, like, okay, nope, that you can't go there. Okay, nope, okay, no, but you okay, that's okay, but no, this is okay. And there wasn't always a rhyme or reason for it. So it was a lot of really trial and error to try and figure out what the fuck am I allowed to do? Because I think it was very, in the same way that sometimes it would work, because people would be like, oh, it's so great to see a woman doing this and doing that. For all of the positives, you could also have the same negatives where it was like, I mean, people were just fucking outraged, you know, like, how dare you, you know, and, you know, you're basically, they would see you as, you know, like you're obviously, you'd get all the things of like, you're a whore, you're a slut, you're this, because you're a woman and you're out on the street and you're doing this and you're doing that. It's like, you know, so that was the double-edged sword. Sorry?
How did that stuff make you feel here I mean, it's quite horrible things, especially when you know that this is a character and this is a piece of craft. How did it make you feel uncomfortable? Did it make you feel bad?
Oh, I'm sure it did. I mean, I probably blocked a lot of it out now, but I'm fine, you know, but I think like, no, I'm sure it was like, there were times where it was really hard. And again, I didn't necessarily have the female companionship to sort of go to have that support. It was just me. And that was it, you know? And so sometimes you would get the support of the guys, and sometimes the guys would be kind of like, you can't fucking do that, you know? And it's like, yeah, but look what you're doing, you know? And they'd be like, no, you can't. I'm like, yeah, but you're all getting your shirts off. You're doing all these jokes about pulling stuff over your dick. You're getting young volunteers that are women out that are basically teenagers, and you're doing sexual innuendos with them. That's okay. That's family friendly. That's festival appropriate. But God forbid a grown woman gets a grown man out at his own consent and gets him to do shit. But, you know, then you're a whore, then you're crossing boundaries, then you're this, then you're that. So it's like, okay, whatever, you know. But what was hard at the time was that I didn't necessarily have a lot of, because there were so few women that were on the pitches, you just didn't have a lot of, it was a lot of just, you didn't have a lot of support with other females. But then it was when I met Abby. Abby, I don't know if you know Abby Collins.
Yes, yeah.
So Abby, I met. It was in Australia, and I met Abby. She was living with Hotch at the time in Melbourne, and I would say that probably aside from Mez, Abby became like my first real, genuine friend. And she was like fucking solid and great, and she was just like, she's like, you just need to keep doing what you're doing. She's like, you're not doing anything wrong. She's like, just keep doing what you're doing. And she had this amazing show that was all about Cleopatra, and she had the men dressed up as centurions, and it was just so creative. And she had one side of the audience was barracking for Rome, and it was so creative. And I just remember seeing it going, oh no, you can do something. This is a theatrical show. And I was like, you can do that, So, and then she was also just a really fun person and was really supportive. So that was really helpful as well, I think. But yeah, definitely there were probably, it wasn't always easy. I mean, yeah, when I think back to it now, I'm just sort of like, fuck, what was I thinking? It was so
Do you feel like you
crazy.
Were you railing against something? Did you feel like you were pushing against a kind of a social injustice, trying to have social effect by doing it?
Yeah. I mean, when I look at it now, yeah. What's interesting too is because of the way things have definitely changed over, and the awareness of like stuff like the whole Me Too movement and everything that's kind of opened up. Now I look back at certain things, and what's hilarious is that at that time, my show was seen as inappropriate, risque, except for like I do it in Europe and stuff like that. But for a lot of the times, it was kind of like, and it was always funny because it was male bookers sometimes that their own shows. I'd look at it and I go, do you not see that what you're doing is just as risque, or you're playing with sex in the same way that I am? And they could not see it. But my point to it is that, so my show was seen as, burlesque or this or whatever. Fast forward 20 years under the lens of Me Too and everything else, my show now, by a lot of standards, is seen as woke. So it's fucking ridiculous. Like, it's just, it's so crazy because people are like, oh, we know what you're doing and this is great. And, and just like, well, I'm doing the same thing I did 20 years ago. It's just that, maybe the lens has changed a little bit. That, you know what I mean? I don't know.
Well, it's very interesting to watch that through your career, you've gone from being this kind of challenging and negatively judged, over sexualized, kind of inappropriate piece of work to something which is now seen as being socially accepted and challenged by broad society, the exact people who would have judged you before.
Oh, now you're a fucking hero. I mean, it's so hilarious, and so it's kind of funny in a way because, but to be fair, I did put a lot of work into my show to make it so that there was way more nuance to it. And like I say, putting the Canada characters in and making the volunteers the heroes of the show. So to be fair, I did do a lot of work to make the show as much better now than it was. But the essence of it, of kind of like, that of like being like, no, what's wrong with me being in control? Like, what's wrong with me being the woman that's in control? You're going to see this show through the male, we've seen so much of the male gaze. So now it's like, why is it seen as why are you seen as a whore, as a slut or this, if I flip it? And now I want you to see it through the female gaze, and I'm going to use these guys as props. But, you have to do it in such a subtle way because they're still people, and these guys coming up, men are still human beings that have their own vulnerabilities and their own feelings. And, you don't want anyone, I had to grow as a person myself to go, I have a responsibility as a person and as a performer to take care of these men when they come up on stage, to make sure that they're not being abused in a way that they feel badly or they're having a negative experience. So it was really, I had to grow as a person to kind of go, no, your biggest mission is to make sure that they have fun and that they're celebrated and made as heroes for doing this. So I mean, like I say, to be fair, my show definitely got better as I think I grew as a performer and as a person. But essentially, it is interesting to sort of see that, like, yeah, that element of what at one point was seen as like, ooh, you're a woman and you're doing this and you're doing that. And I'm not the first woman to do that on the street. Like, there were so many women before me, you know, like Tamara had been around and Abby had been around. Petra Massey had done a show. There was another performer called Kate the Great. She was fantastic. And she did this whole thing with she had this bra that had a pointer on it, and she'd spin a ball on her nipple. And Cherie Vickers had the Tits of Fire. So she had this bra that had wicks on it that would light on fire. And her volunteer had 2 oven mitts, and he had to come and like put out the fire. It was fucking hilarious. So again, I am not the first woman to play with that at all, and won't be the last, you know. But this is just from my own experience at that time, trying to what I went through. And I was like, fuck, this is really hard. You know, there was a real period there where it was like, you were not only fighting of learning about, you know, street performing is hard in general, but then it was like there were a lot of societal things to fight against. And then looking at it now, where I go, and I was a woman who was, you know, I was white, I was privileged, so I can only imagine what it might have been like for other women who, you know, I mean, in that way, I had a lot of things that were easier potentially for me because of that. So I can't imagine what it would be like, you know, having more up against more challenges and trying to do that. So yeah.
Well, there is this whole discussion, isn't there, between street pitches, particularly about access and about how welcoming people make pitches and how much hazing people do, and how much, because I know that historically in Covent Garden, people were dickish to new people because they want to keep numbers down. And I know that in multiple pitches around the world, that's still a very quietly sustained thing. And then you think some beautiful, interesting piece of work must get pushed out the door before they've begun to root.
Sure.
Because of that kind of environment, particularly for people who have everything against them in the rest of the world anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because, sorry, go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, you carry on. I was waiting to hear what you're going to say.
Oh, no, I agree. And I think, you know, I've been on both sides. I mean, I'm sure that there's times where I've intimidated people, or there's times where I have not always been, you know, because you do, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because you have this one pitch that, like, for circle acts, like for instance, on Granville Island, the circle acts we have one pitch now. And within that one pitch, we probably get 3 slots to work. And so they've kind of made it so there's so limited access for circle shows now. So I think what happens is that sometimes people get kind of like, you know, you can get territorial where you sort of go, you know, oh, someone's going to come on the 2 p.m. triangle. It's the prime time, and they're going to, you know, fucking blow bubbles or read out of a phone book for this. And you're like, are you kidding me? Like, you get really, you know, so you kind of go, well, what are the standards? You know, what categorizes someone? I know when I started, I was not allowed to work the main pitch, and I wasn't allowed to take prime time, and I had to earn the right to do that.
And do you think that's right?
The way it was.
Do you think that was the right thing to have done? Do you agree with it?
I don't know. I mean, personally, I think it made me better. From my experience, I'm glad it was that way for me, because what it did do. But again, it depends on what other opportunities are out there. And Granville Island at the time, they had this one little spot called the Pit, and it was in the back, and it was just like a lot of magicians played down there. So you could book the Pit for 2 hours, and you could do whatever you want in 2 hours. So in a way, it made me better, because I would go and book that spot for 2 hours, and I would pump out like 10 little shows, and I got way better. And I think Bendy M has a similar experience where when she first went to Edinburgh, she never worked the main big pitches. She just booked one of the, where the statues work on the side. And she would just, she would just go in there and she would just crank out tons of little shows. And it was like that summer in Edinburgh, I remember seeing her go from here to here. So in a way, I think if you embrace that and kind of go, maybe I do need to wait until I'm ready, and maybe there's something I need to do about this. For me, I'm glad, because I think it made me better. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So if we can take the social changes and just take them out of the context just for now, and just look at access to pitches, the crowds that are watching shows, and the festivals that are around, do you believe when you began in the 90s and then following on to that in the 2000s was a better, easier, more fruitful time to be a street performer than the 210s or the 220s that we find ourselves in now?
I only know my own experience, so I can't really say. Like, it's funny because I feel like a lot of performers have kind of like, oh, that was the golden era. And oh no, that was the golden era. But it was like, well, that was just in your mind. That was the time that you were flourishing the most. Sorry about the dog. The dog's gone nuts. Hang on a second. Come here. Stop it.
So it's interesting Sharon saying this, because I mean, I look back at the times that people tell me about in the 80s or the 90s, and it seems like it was this amazing period where every show was original and everything was great. But maybe it is rose-colored spectacles, like Sharon's saying. Sorry, carry on.
No, here, she wants to come and be in. I think she wanted to come and say hi. Here she is.
Oh, hello, little one.
You gonna calm down now? Sorry.
So you were saying before, I think the point you were inferring to is that maybe it's rose-tinted spectacles in terms of the gold.
I think definitely. I mean, I think that there's probably that. I do think that, I mean, again, I wasn't around. I wasn't doing street shows in the 80s, so I don't know. I do probably believe that there was a period in the 80s and the early 90s where there might have been more of a creative element. Like when you look at it, I mean, I've said this before, but I think like Anthony Livingspace is probably one of my favorite performers. I could watch him, do the same trick, but he's the same bit, but he's so funny. And I think probably at the time that he was coming up, there did seem to be like this more like experimentational kind of, not everybody, but there was more of that. Where now I feel like, not that one is bad or worse, but it feels like there's much more of a corporate element to it now. And
do you think that people like Anthony Livingspace and potentially like yourself when you were first beginning, and people who don't have the right colored pens and have gone to circus school and are prepared for a career in festival entertainment, do you think they have a shot nowadays?
You mean the people that have more of a creative, that want to experiment and whatnot?
Yeah, and they're kind of, entertaining talented fuck-ups, like it seems people used to be.
Yeah, no, I know. It's a really good question, Matt. A really good question. And I don't know that I have the answer. I don't know, to be honest. I think it is, I don't know. I mean, I definitely think that there is, because it's circus schools, again, like I said, when I went to theater school, we never heard about circus school. That was never an option. That was never even a viability. Had I known about it, I probably would have loved to have done something like that, but it was just never even, nobody knew about it. Where now it's definitely something that is like, circus school is really more of a mainstream. Like, I mean, you can go to these circus schools now and get a university degree. Like it's so much more accessible now. So it's cranking out all these really high skilled young performers. And so I think that where 20 years ago it was sort of like, you were kind of, you had to be a little bit of a fringe weirdo to want to do street performing. Now it's kind of like, oh no, there's money to be made here. You can do circus school. You can kind of do click, 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 do this, go out on the street, work out your show. Then you can do that. And I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. It's just what it is. So I think it's attracting a different type now in general than what it might have done 25 years ago.
Yeah, I certainly think it's possible. I mean, maybe Street still has those losers and weirdos going there doing their things, but I think the festival circuit, which used to, put a net out and scrape the streets for all those weirdos, now has an email list which people from the circus schools go to, and it seems like those festival circuits pop by that. Maybe I'm because I'm not. Who knows what? We're reaching nearly the end of the interview now, so I've got a couple of questions to ask.
We can go longer, darling. It's okay. We got. It's okay. Well, yeah.
Okay, cool. If you want to go a little bit longer, then we were in Australia. We came from Australia, and when we came from Australia, we started putting Sharon in and doing the Canadian Sharon in, and then doing the two characters together in the shows. How did that evolve then? How did you slowly start working that? And when did you start doing big international festivals as opposed to working in Australia and going back to Canada?
Well, Shelley Switzer gave me my first real gig, and I always will give her credit for this. And it was her first year doing the street festival as a producer, and it was my first year street performing. So, and she hired me, and she was like, I want to encourage more women. So she said, I know that you're new, but she said, I really believe that by bringing you in here and exposing you to this, it will help you grow. And so I remember that first year that I did that festival. I mean, I probably got it before I was ready, to be honest, because that was like 2000, 2001. So again, that comes back to how it's a double-edged sword, where it was like, some pitches would be really, really hard. But then like I got that festival probably because I was a woman doing something that wasn't stock and standard. Do you know what I mean? So on the flip side, that's where it was, anyways, but yeah, that's when I saw, I remember seeing Pee Wee and Emma, and they had their, they were fucking funny. Their characters were so good. And I just remember seeing all these, that's when the festival circuit, you would see a lot more creative stuff. So, kudos to Shelley for sort of recognizing that and going, no, it's not just this, there's this as well. And it did sort of expose me, because the festival circuit allows for stuff that wouldn't necessarily not survive, but, like if you took a really creative show and put it on a pitch, because they might not make the money, or they might not get the edges, or this or that, whatever. A lot of the times they do flourish at festivals because it's like a theater on the street, and people will allow for weirder shit to happen there. So in a way it did.
Focus, don't you? You get more focus in a festival. You get a crowd that will view the thing in the framing that it needs to be viewed in. Whereas,
exactly.
Someone who just ate a bag of chips and, drank half a can of Stella might not be looking at the subtextual inferences made by this relationship, between two characters.
Totally. So I think that was definitely, that really opened my eyes a lot. And then I went to Edinburgh that summer. That was, again, I think that was like 2000. And I met so many people over there, saw so much weird shit. And then it was when I started going to Europe. I started to get, what was great is that the European festivals really liked me, because they're much more open about all that stuff. So then I started to go to Europe a lot, and then I just saw the weirdest shit out there. And I was like, oh my God, my show is so stock now. Like, I'm not even theatrical compared to this stuff. This is out there, but it was great, so that I would say to
in France, if they have funding, people get paid yearly kind of stipend, a benefit to develop shows, and then they
Exactly.
just go and perform. I mean, I was amazed when I first went to a European festival and saw a 5-person theatrically prepared street show. I was like, how the fuck do you
Yeah.
pay for this?
It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah, absolutely. So that really opened my eyes a lot too, where and then it kind of became more of a mission of like going, oh, I really want to work on these characters. So then it was like, starting to go, well, maybe I want to go back, train more and take these characters into training workshops and doing more stuff and really finding. And so then I kind of got into that where I was like really working on finding those different, especially I remember taking the Canada character into a bunch of different workshops and working with different people and really trying to, and that was really fun because then you can kind of find
Can you
different
explain that
layers.
a bit more? What I mean, how do you take a character into a workshop? I've never done any of this stuff,
Yeah.
so it's all
Um,
mystery.
yeah. So like, I mean, they sometimes they would have like at festivals, like for instance, like in Adelaide a number of years ago, they used to have workshops where like, they had Fraser Hooper would do a character workshop. And you could do like it was in Adelaide, and you could do 2 weeks of a character workshop. And so I would just find all these different things, and then I would take that character in it, and you'd go do all these different, they put you through your paces, and you could just find all these different levels and sort of like, and it really helped a lot. It really kind of helped find, get in the skin of that. So
And what kind
I
of stuff
definitely
did they do? Would they tell you to incorporate the character and then you'd play with another person testing that character? Is that how the
Yeah. And you would be, like Fraser does a lot of clown workshops and coaching. So he would, he would basically do the same exercises, but you could bring a character in to work through those exercises, and you could just find a lot of really neat stuff.
And you feel like that really
So
helped you formulate your character and administer your character in the street show?
totally. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Yeah, for sure. But again, I think I do also believe that, but then I do really believe that like street performing is really the school of hard knocks. Like until you get it out there and put it on the pavement, you don't know what's going to happen. Is it going to work or is it not going to work? But it is kind of that, like I remember doing the Spy Monkey workshop in London years ago, and then going out and then doing a street show and really trying to apply a lot of the stuff that we worked on. And you're like, yeah, like maybe not all of the stuff that we did is going to work on the street that it did work in the theater, but then a lot of it might have been my own fear, where it was just sort of like, why can't it? If you let it, if you give it the confidence, it totally could.
Is that like you play test it in your head, and when you play test it in your head, you go, of course that won't work, and so you never try
Yeah.
it? Or so it's not even necessarily trying it and killing it in your own head and negging the audience out with it because you don't think it's going to work. Just not trying it in the first place.
Yeah, it's taking that risk and feeling vulnerable and going, I know that if I do this, I'm safe. And I know that if I do this, I'm taking a risk. It may or may not work, but it could end up becoming something better. So it's just being able to be vulnerable, to take that risk. And it's hard being vulnerable on the street because it can be so unforgiving,
You're trained not to be. You're trained to be indestructible because, like you said, in Australia with transition, people walk on you. So you're trained. The audience constantly training you to not roll over at any point.
Yeah. Totally. So I think when I see someone being really vulnerable in a street show or taking risks, like I think that's why I love Anthony so much, because you're just like, this is the craziest shit. Like he's really putting himself out there doing some of these routines. And that's like, I think just, it's actually a really brave thing to make yourself that vulnerable in a street show.
To let it possibly go wrong. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So after doing all these workshops, is this the point where the show really coalesces and you really feel like you've got not a finished, I don't know if we'd ever say you'd have a finished product, but you feel like you have a cohesive piece of work?
Yeah, it definitely was really made more sense. And you could see it. I mean, other performers would come up and be like, I really like your show now. Like people who really didn't like my show, and I know they didn't like my show, would be like, they're like, I actually kind of get, I get what you're doing now. And that's could be on me too, where it was like, okay, like in my head I know what I was doing, but if it was a whole thing. I had this one uh, teacher once, and she was like, it's a great saying, and maybe it wasn't even hers, but it's a great saying. She's like, if the audience is getting off and you're getting off, it's theater. Uh, if the audience is getting off and you're not getting off, it's theater. If you're getting off and the audience isn't getting off, it's masturbation. So, at what point maybe was it that I knew what I was doing and I was getting off from it, but not everybody understood or got off on what I was doing? So, how much of that do you go, was I masturbating? But in my mind, I knew what I was doing. So, I think it took a while for my vision and my idea to meet to where other people were kind of seeing it where I saw it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like you're refining the craft to be able to deliver the intent, right?
Yeah. And that's just growth. That's just, I think, just growth as a performer and growth as a show. Like they say, like, you have to do at least 100 shows until you know what you're working with. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's just time put in.
So you got the show, this show that works now. People are coming up to you who may have begrudgingly said, a year before, oh, well done, and now saying they really get it, they really enjoy it. What do you do with it now you've got it?
Well, that's when I started to get more festival work, and that was really great. I actually really enjoyed working at the festivals because, there was less stress of like trying to figure, you get and it was the hang as well. You were with people that you liked being around, and it was fun. So, yeah, I started to get more festival work, and that definitely, yeah, that was.
And were you sending promos out for that? How are you garnering the festival work?
Yeah, both sending out promos, and then a lot of it would snowball where you do one festival, and then someone would say, oh, well, this, we heard about you, or we saw you at this festival, because sometimes producers will go and scout at other events, and they're like, we saw you here, we really like you. And but I mean, I was pretty assertive in that way. Like I remember how I got the championship, the Busker World Championship that used to happen in Dublin. I remember those guys, they had been, a couple of people recommended me for that, but they were like, until we're not really booking stuff unless we see it. And that's a lot of Europe, is like, unless they see your show, they won't book you. So I went, and then I booked myself into this showcase festival, and then I called those guys up, and I just said, I was like, this is where I'm going to be. I was like, I called this showcase festival. They will give you free accommodation, this and that, whatever. You can get a cheap flight. I'm like, this is where I'm going to be performing. Come and see my show. And that's how I got into that one. So I was pretty assertive. I was a hustler in that way. So, yeah, it was, just trying.
So you weren't shy. You made your case.
Definitely. Yeah. The hustle, and that's why I like about the States, because, and it does really help with stand up too, because especially, I mean, you have to hustle a lot, and sometimes it's not always the best performer, but it's one who makes opportunity for themselves. And it's like, you have to, but that is something that I do really like about America, is that they admire the hustle, where in other places they might see it as kind of like, oh, that's a bit brash, or that person's a bit, where here they're almost like, that's part of the American dream, so they kind of like it. They're sort of like, I like your hustle, so yeah.
And were you doing stand-up the entire time you were doing the circle shows in Australia and going to do the other festivals? Did you keep the stand-up going all the way through?
I did, apart from a couple of years I took off, and then and I took maybe about 2 or 3 years off in the early 2000s. And then I remember, I remember having a talk with, it was Amy Saunders I was talking with, actually. I remember being in Australia, and I was talking to her about different stuff. And then she was just like, you have to start doing stand-up again. She's like, you just have to start doing it. And she was right. And so then I went back and kept plugging away at it and plugging away at it. And then it was probably, there was a certain point where I just went, fuck it, I'm doubling down on it. Because I always sort of kept doing it, but it was kind of like I would flirt with it and do it, and I would flirt with it and then go off and do these street performing tours, and then I'd come back and do stand up during the winter or whatever or whatnot. And then there was definitely a time.
I take it stand up still wasn't making money for you at that time. It was more of a labor of love.
Yeah, absolutely, because it really is a lot of free gigs, a lot of, or if you get paid, it's not like street performing in the sense you can't necessarily make a living at it until you get to a certain level. Now it's different though. I mean, now is so different because of the way the world with online streaming and, you can the way that you can make albums now and get them out on and get royalties. It's a whole other world now. But definitely at that time, insofar as club work goes and getting paid for live gigs, it was, yeah, I mean, it's definitely a labor of love. Like you have to want to do it or, so, but there was really a point I remember where I just went, fuck it, I'm just going to double down on it. And I'm just going to put everything into it, go for it. Shit or get off the pot. So, but I think the tenacity from street performing, I definitely see a correlation where it was like the way that I approached street performing with that same tenacity of like going, I'm not going to give up and I'm not going to have somebody intimidate me out of doing this challenge is kind of where in my mind I went, well, I know that I was able to not figure out, but you know what I mean? Whereas I was able to kind of accomplish something in street performing with that same mentality. So if I use that same mentality and just double down on stand up, let's see where it takes me. Because if I use the same tenacity that I used to get where I got in street performing, but put it down into stand up, I'm not going to, go ahead.
Did you feel safer in doubling down in the stand up? Because for one, that you could be successful because you've already been successful in a very, despite the fact you can make a good living out of it, it's quite a difficult thing to become successful with, particularly being creative, being in the, the international festival circuit. Not everyone makes it there. So did you feel like what you said before, so I think I know this, that you did feel like that success emboldened you, but did you also have a security from that? Because that's making an income.
Oh, for sure. 100%. Like the irony was too, is that at the time, a lot of stand-up performers would look down on street performers. And it was just like, whatever, and not that there's anything wrong with this, but it's like, you guys are slugging coffee at Starbucks, and I'm going out doing something I love. I'm being flown into all these other places and I'm making, fairly decent money. So you look down on me all you want. But I had the financial and not just the financial freedom. I also had the lifestyle freedom where I could do stuff with other people didn't necessarily have the opportunity because they had a 9-to-5 job, because they couldn't just pack up and go to a festival. So I had the freedom to be able to go, no, fuck it, I'm going to go and do a tour in Australia and I'm going to do my street show and I'm going to bring a stand-up show and I'm going to go there for 3 months and do that. And, and so were other people that just didn't have that same freedom to do that. So yeah, it gave you a little bit more where you could think outside of the box. Because definitely, I think, especially in North America and in Canada, there's really sort of like, you have to jump through these hoops to get this. You have to do this, 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 and then you'll get this. And I think what is great about like my journey was kind of like, well, do I? Because I don't actually know that I need to do that or that I want to do that. I can go over here and do this whole circuit. I can make my own show and go over here. And so I'm not saying one's better. It was just sort of like, it did give you a different perspective of going, there's more than one way to go after something.
Well, it does seem a little bit like, at least in London, just from the outside, looking at the young stand-ups world, trying to get into it, it's a bit of a treadmill that a lot of people never get off. They go, they do open mics, they're basically paying to do the open mics. They're all the money's going to the person promoting. They might occasionally get a gig here and here, but you're just skimming the very top of this very deep pint glass of people inside that circle.
Yeah. So you have to be creative with being creative. And I think that's like that was a great thing about street performing. I think because it does teach you those lessons where you kind of go. I mean, again, it comes back to like what I was saying when I was on Granville Island, where I was like, oh my God, these people beat the system. You know, it was the same thing about going. You know, if you want to get into film, you have to do this, and you have to go out and do these cattle calls and audition, and let somebody else make a decision about whether you're going to work or not. And then to see that there was this other way where you can actually have more control, and you can essentially, I was like, yeah, you could beat the system. So in the same way that I think street performing allows you to see that, I think that the same thing, that whatever it is that you approach, it gives you a little bit more open-mindedness to kind of go, well, maybe is there a way that I can do this that isn't necessarily just going from A to B, you know? And
so
I think that they're valuable.
Yeah. Did you do, so essentially going to the comedy clubs, was that kind of like getting in the gym and knocking the bag around? And then in terms of making a career as a stand-up and developing that career, was that more doing the one-woman shows in the festivals, the stand-up one-woman shows indoors in venues?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd been doing stand-up in Canada for a while, like going to the, you know, doing a lot of, you know, clubs, comedy, mics, and this and that, whatever. I've been, you know, sort of playing around in it for quite a while. But I think it was when I started really writing my own one-person shows that I could definitely see that you could see you just move up. You would get stronger. You would start thinking about what is it that I want to say, you know? And I mean, yeah. And like, what's my point of view? What is it that I want to talk about? And just, there's nothing more valuable than doing, like being at a festival, like Edinburgh, for example. I mean, you're doing sometimes 40 shows. I mean, you do to be in a place where you're doing an hour 40 times in a night it's invaluable. It's so you either come out of that and you want to check yourself into a psych ward, or you just go, you have to be better by the end of that. There's no question about it, you know? So to put yourself in those opportunities where you go, yeah, you're going to work your ass off. It's going to be hard. There might not be a financial benefit to this, but you will come out of it stronger. And so I think that as opposed to going in and maybe doing 3 sets a night of 5 or 7 minutes, like it just, yeah, it does. It makes you, it just is, again, it's another way of going about it.
And you said this thing about figuring out what you have to say, what you want to say, what's your standpoint on things.
Yeah.
And yet it crossed me talking to you before. It crossed
Sorry,
me
you
that
cut
you
out
had
there,
that already in your street show. You were trying to say things.
Yeah, yeah. So it was
sorry,
like that
yeah.
was no, that's yeah, it's just like, you know, I think that's what I found like interesting. But again, it's sort of like there were stand-ups that I liked, and I was like, well, what is it that I like about them? And when I stop and think about what I like about them, a lot of the times it was like, well, it was either there was a social commentary on, and you know, and then sometimes you just want to see someone be an idiot. You know, there's nothing better than just seeing someone be a fucking idiot for no reason whatsoever. But for stand-up, it was like a lot of the times where I'm like, you know, people having like, I loved Joan Rivers because she would just, oh my God, she would just take things and just reduce it to just deduce it down to this level where you're like, oh my God, that's fucking great. Don Rickles was the ultimate insult comic. I grew up loving watching Don Rickles. And so it was just kind of like everybody had this sort of point of view where it was, you know, what is it that you want to say? And, you know, and then you see people like Richard Pryor, who had this real fucked up upbringing. And, you know, but then he could take the darkest stuff and talk about it and twist it in such a way that you're like, I can't believe we're all laughing at this. Like, this is such gallows humor, but, you know, this is brilliant. So there was, I think it's also like it can be a real coping mechanism for people where it's like, you know, it's a survival to kind of find the funny in it.
But didn't you have that to an extent? And obviously, it's not gallows humor as much, but you were trying to say something, even if it wasn't directly saying something in your street work. It was challenging. It was playing with stuff. You had something to say then, right? In the street.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I don't want to put too much on, like, sort of, because you can sort of get really down those things of like, what's your message? Then it's kind of like, well, then you also want to be balanced to kind of go, I just want people to be entertained. If they take something from it, great. But, I also think that sometimes you can play too heavily on the fact of like, I'm, you don't want to become in your head, you don't want to think that you're a prophet or something like that. It's like, let's all be real. We are entertainers. That's
But
the biggest thing that we want.
Isn't it more, it's more closer to the prophet position in stand-up? There's almost like Richard Pryor, or you look at these stand-up comedians as opposed to, say, like variety entertainers. They're looking for truth somewhere, right? There's this idea that they're going to have some insight.
Yeah, and I think what the difference is what allows you to do that in stand-up is because you have, you have the focus, you have the walls, you have the time to be able to sit in the silence, and you have the subtleties, where you don't necessarily have that in street performing. So it is really like in street performing, it has to be very big for the most part, and there's not a lot of room for subtleties. And where in stand-up, you can really lean into that, and you can really take the time to kind of go, and so and you're going up with nothing. There's nothing more exciting to me than dropping all that stuff and going, no props, no costumes. You go up essentially naked, and, what are you going to do with it? And it comes back to the same thing. It comes back to the same thing of like what Dom was saying to me, but when I was trying to street perform, where he's just like, you don't need anything. You go up with a fucking envelope, you can figure out how to do that. All this other stuff is, so there's something about that I love, just to be able to go up, and go, I'm just going to go up. All I have is what I want to say.
It's a terrifying thing going up there without an agenda. I've watched your stand-up show, Thundercunt, when it was in Edinburgh, and I thought it was a thoroughly enjoyable show. I had a great time there. Did that kind of whole piece of work, was that the first one-woman show you did was like that? And I don't mean necessarily identically the same, but as polished and as finished. Did it start off being, more rudimentary?
I've done a few one-woman shows before that. I had one show that was called The Last Steel Body, and that was on my great aunt Marion, who essentially was the last. She had a car that was a Monte Carlo, and she used to say it was the last steel body, but she essentially was also one of the last steel bodies. She was one of these, survivors from the Depression and the war, and so I did one show about that. Then I had another show that was called The Lion, the Bitch, and the Wardrobe. And I did that. I took that. I brought that to Australia, and I did that through the Canadian Fringe Circuit. And then I did Thundercunt. And then my new show that I just have been working on for the last 2 years is called Relevant Cunt. And that I made into a comedy album that's going to be released this year. So, I'm trying to go. Sorry, go ahead.
How does it take you to write and develop an hour-long one-woman show?
Well, yeah, it's usually, some people are way better at it than I am. I know some people have different ways of working. And so I'm not necessarily one that will sit down and write out a show. I'm somebody I have to perform in order to write. So I'll have an idea and I'll take it to the club and I'll try it out. It becomes a bit. Then you're like, okay, that's a new bit. Then I'll have another idea and then I'll work it out. It becomes another bit. And then all of a sudden you have 30 minutes of new material. And then what is interesting is that a lot of the times, just because of where you are in your life, you look at it and you go, well, of course this has a thematic thing to it, because at this point in my life, this is what's going on in my head. And these are the things that I find funny right now because I want to talk about them. And there is a connection to it because this is what I'm mulling over. So then ultimately, you just keep plugging away. By the end of a year, if you keep working on new material, you can have 30 minutes to 40 minutes of new material. And there usually is some sort of a...
Yeah. Do you think that has something to do with being a street performer? The sort of I think they call it no writing, right? The idea that you go out there with an idea and you then work it into, you manipulate it essentially on spot in the moment into a workable concept and a workable piece. Do you reckon that comes from doing street performance?
For sure. Yeah, definitely. And I think it also, comes back from wanting to have that improvisation background of, like, for whatever reason, with the way that my brain works, I probably have a mild form of a disability in the fact of, like, some form of, whether, I don't know, like, I never was, I enjoyed school, but it was something that never came naturally to me in the sense that I got concepts, I understood it. But then when it came to the actual way that our system is set up to write things and to do this and to do that, my brain didn't work that way. So I think improvisation was something that came easier to me. For whatever reason, my brain works that way. And so when I saw improvisation, I was kind of like, that's why I say when I sat there and things kind of went, oh, it all fit into place, where I was like, oh, fuck this, I get this. So I think...
So when you say an egg, you'd say very much that you are the reason you moved into the things you're doing, and that's the continuous...
Absolutely. I think you kind of gravitate towards what you're attracted to, and then it's sort of up to us to kind of make it happen, but I definitely think that for whatever reason, and some people don't work that way. I know some stand-up comics that improvisation is their worst nightmare. They have to sit down and have everything crafted out. But they're really good writers. But, they'll sit down and they're very disciplined about writing a joke and rewriting it and this and that, whatever. To me, that's torture. To me, I want to be able to go up on stage. To me, the audience is the writing. If they're laughing, if it works at that moment and I can hear the music in my mind that the beat worked there and I'm getting the laugh there, that's not working there because the audience isn't missing there. It's not landing there. Okay, well, how do I rearrange these? It's like, how do I fix this nomenclature so that that's going to happen? And it should sound, that that's how my brain works, not sitting down doing this. Not to say one is right or wrong. It's just the way that my brain works. So, but I know a lot of people work that way too. Like, I know when COVID happened, there were a lot of comedians that were like, found it really difficult to write new material because they couldn't perform. So I think, my street show, a lot of my lines that I created came from, improvising or accidents that you go, fuck, that worked. Okay, that's staying in,
Yeah, exactly that. Some of the best things are things where your brain has done look for you without you even realizing. The subconscious has really just processed it and then compelled you to throw something out there.
Totally.
I get this when I write. So I'll begin to try and write comedy, and it will feel like the most horrible words in the world when I write them down. There's nothing funny about it in the world. But then if I sit in front of hundreds of people and I think about things to say, funny things come out. Is it a similar thing? Is this the thing we're talking about? You can't stand the process of putting words to paper. It's like they die in between this thing,
Yeah. Again, everybody's different and everybody works in different ways. I think one thing that helped me as a stand-up that I really felt when I started to I could significantly feel a shift in me as a stand-up comedian was going, when you're with your friends or when you're with people that you really like and they're really laughing at you, that's where you want to be on stage. If you can tap into that, but just be in front of strangers, but doing that same thing and genuinely being within the same molecular of that, telling the same stuff. If you can get that comfortable, that's where you want to be. So it was really thinking about it and kind of going, okay, so if I'm with my friends and I'm telling them this story and they're laughing, I'm like, okay, write that down. That's potentially a bit. Then get up on stage and try it out in front of strangers and see how it works, you know.
And do you see yourself now still heading towards Saturday Night Live and doing the kind of skit shows and that kind of stuff?
I don't know. I don't like, I feel like, to be honest, I kind of feel like right now, what I would really like to do is, I mean, I would really like to just do more touring as a headlining stand-up comedian. So just, I would like to be able to put out a new album every 2 years, maybe, and tour, just keep touring and doing like as a performing, working in theaters and comedy clubs. That's kind of what I would like to do now. If something like that happened, I wouldn't necessarily say no to it, but I think it's, I don't know, I kind of think like realistically, I think what is more palpable is me just really pushing at trying to be the best stand-up comedian that I could be. That's kind of what and like, I'm really about like doing the action, putting in the work, and then the results are kind of, to some degree, letting go of it. But that's ultimately what I want to do, is just, you know, kind of just tour and do, you know, try and do as many, ultimately just become a, you know, a comedian that can do, you know, bigger, not necessarily bigger, but, you know, be able to go and sell out a theater and headline and do this and do that. And, you know, and then keep creating content that goes out online. Because like I say, I think the world has changed so much. It's, you can produce and put out content now in so many different ways. It's incredible. It really is a whole new world. It's awesome.
Yeah, very much so. And do you see yourself as doing street and doing the street festivals and being in the street pitches, climbing on top of the ladders of guys? I
think, I mean, it's funny because I was always like, oh, I don't care. I'll do this until I'm 80. But then, like, I think there probably will come a point where the stand-up will just completely eclipse the street performing, perhaps, but I don't know. I mean, I'm really still enjoying doing, like, what I'm getting more into now with my street show is doing fairs. And I never thought I'd say that I really enjoyed it, but they're really fun. And it's
these, what's the name for? We don't have them in the UK very often, so they're medieval fairs, right?
No, they're like there is that, but not that. This is not what I'm talking about. But like, we have like, so I did the PNE last year, which is the Pacific National Exhibition in Vancouver. And it's a fair that's set up. It runs for 10 days. And then you do your show for 10 days. You get paid a certain amount. And then now I'm starting to do, there's a huge market in the States. So I'm starting to get more into that, where you come in for 10 or 15 days and you do your show for those 10 or 15 days. You get paid a certain amount. And I'm actually really like, now I kind of am just going, well, no, I'm kind of enjoying doing that. And it's, you know, it's paid work, and you can still go in and do that part of you. So I think I would like to kind of play around with that for the next little while. But ultimately, just. But
you don't see yourself going on and doing hardcore street. You're not going to go back in the middle of winter and perform in an older fair somewhere.
I don't. Yeah, I kind of feel like, not that there's anything wrong with that, but I think there's also in my mind where what was great about COVID, it was like sort of like, you're not allowed to do that. So it pushed me to go, well, I have to make something else successful. So there is something to be said about almost, I mean, I'm not closing a door to street theater because I love it and I still will keep doing it to a certain degree. But there is something to be said about not closing the door, but kind of, you know, just pushing a little bit so that there's more room for other stuff to come in. Because if you only have one thing that's coming down, you're not making room for other stuff. So it's a matter of just moving the door over a bit and kind of going, okay, I'm consciously moving it over here so that it's forcing me to put more investment into this. And it does, it's just sort of like the laws of physics that it's going to make that more stuff happen in that part of your life, I think. So.
And you said during COVID, your work changed and you developed different ways to be able to keep working during lockdowns.
Yeah. Well, like I say, we because we couldn't do busking, and if we did, we started doing Zoom shows, and I actually started to like them because I figured out how to sort of have fun with it, and then Zoom got better, but then I figured out how to crowd work in it, and I was kind of like, oh, this is actually kind of fun. So weirdly, I kind of got into that, and and then also just realizing that there were a lot of people I knew that even when the lockdown happened, they're like, well, they were making royalties from their streaming. And I'm like, fuck, this is something I got to get into, because I'm putting all this energy out into doing these street shows, which is great. But if shit goes wrong, isn't it nice to have this other thing, this other streamline of stuff happening? So it made me just go, okay, you got to get an album together. You got to get this sorted out, get it out there, It's
been an interesting impetus for a lot of people, I think. And you started doing a podcast during that time as well. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I have an episode. I've been very, because I've been touring a lot over the last little bit, that I've been very bad about. I haven't put one out in about a month or so. I've been very naughty, but I have an episode all edited and it's almost ready to go. But yeah, it's called Top Cunts, and it's I interview women that are veterans within their field. So it's usually, because I am sort of at this, what is interesting as well is that there's a lot of women I find, especially, who have worked for decades, and then they get to a point where I'm like, well, they're at the top of their game, and then you face this ceiling of like, you're too old, and I'm like, this is retarded, because it's like, too old for what? For standing on stage telling jokes into a microphone? Like, what do you mean you're too old? Like, it's like ridiculous. It's not like I'm going out and trying to, run a marathon and beat, a 22-year-old who's, it's like some of the funniest, most established people I know have put decades into it. And I don't even think you find your voice as a writer until you reach a certain point in your life even. So it was sort of a mission of mine where I was kind of like, there's a lot of women that I know that I feel are at the top of their game, and yet we're still in this world, especially in the entertainment industry, where we're idolizing youth. And so I was kind of like, well, no, I want to showcase these women that I think that have really done the work and have really worked their tits off, and they're kind of right at they're at the top of their game. And so that was the idea behind it. And it's great because, I've gotten some great women to come on. And then I got the chance to work with Jessica Kirson. I don't know if you know of her. She's an American comedian, but she's been a hero of mine for a long time. She's based out of New York City. She is, I think, one of the funniest people I've ever seen as a stand-up comic. And I got to open for her in Vancouver. It was about a month ago. And she was just so lovely. And we just hit it off as people. And I was like, so she's going to come on and do my podcast as well. And she's another one where I'm like, she's a couple of years older than me. And she has been working so hard for so long. Like all the guys at the comedy, she's like the queen of the Comedy Cellar. Like all the guys are afraid to go up after her, like Dave Attell, even Chappelle, Bill Burr. They're all like, fuck, if we have to follow Jessica, you're sitting there at the bar trying to figure out your game plan. She's just a powerhouse. And yet for whatever reason, I mean, she has a great career, and I really feel like right now she's breaking more so than ever, but it's like, why the fuck this girl didn't have her own television show 20 years ago? I have no idea. Like some of it doesn't make any sense. So anyways, it's people like, she's a perfect example of like, where I go, this person is so undeniably kick ass and has worked so hard. She's a top cunt. And so that's kind of the idea behind it.
That's great. And where can you find that?
Spotify is where I think is the most of it, but you can go, I think it's also on iTunes. I put it up on all of them, So you can find it anywhere. Like literally, probably go to YouPorn. You can probably find it there too. For God's sake, I have no shame. I'll put it anywhere.
If you Google top coats, you might very well find yourself there.
Yeah, exactly.
So, do you see now in the future doing this podcast, doing the online stuff, doing the stand-up? Do you think that you're going to slowly avoid the bitter old street performer thing? Do you see that, right?
Well, I don't want to say no, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just going to see how it. I'm going to see, kind of let go of, see how it all evolves. You know, I mean, right now I'm putting a lot in here, and we'll see what happens. You know, I mean, yeah, I don't want to ever say, I never have any sort of ego about thinking that it's like, I'm really proud to be a street performer. I'm eternally grateful for everything that it's given me. And so I never feel like it's beneath me. But if I also really love doing this.
The thing I reference to that is that I think the street's quite hard. And I think people who get older and keep working on the street, I think some people deal with it really well. And I think some people, when they get to, and this is something I worry about in my own future, working on the street, is that it grinds, especially real street, you know, not necessarily festivals, but working in, you know, the shopping malls, the street sides. When you get to a certain age, it's hard wearing on people, right?
Yeah, you're not wrong. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like just physically being able to carry your gear all around, being able to get down there, it's physically a whole other thing than being able to get in your car, go to a club, walk in with nothing, and, you know, do a comedy show, stand up, and then go home. There's no comparison. I mean, definitely. It is just night and day.
Oh, right. The idea that sometimes crowds won't enjoy what you're doing and they will walk off. And if you're old and you're tired and you really need it and it doesn't happen, and you must know some older buskers. We won't have to name anyone or, you know, make anyone look bad or feel bad, but people who you can see don't enjoy it anymore but can't get out of it. There's no other exit route for them.
Sure. And I mean, I think you could say that with lots of things, you know, like I know that there are lots of people that are doing jobs that they don't want to be doing anymore, but they don't know anything different, you know? So I think that sometimes it's just for whatever reason, people get, you know, circumstance, life, you know, and sometimes people can have, you know, ailments, all sorts of things going on. They might have their own physical problems, mental problems. People might have addictions. And for whatever reason, you know, they're just kind of like, well, this thing that I know, even though it's not giving me the joy that it used to anymore, and maybe I'd like to do something different, but I know this. So it's like the familiar pair of shoes where you're kind of like, well, these shoes aren't working for me anymore, but they still the shoes I know. So I'm just going to keep wearing them, even though they got holes in them. So I mean, you could say that with so many things. There's probably dentists that do that. I know some people that are, you know, physicians that you're like, fuck, you need to retire. You need to stop. Like you're really bitter and you hate your job. Like just stop, you know, but for whatever reason they can't, you know, maybe they have responsibility or they have this or they have that. And they're like, I can't just stop, you know? So I think it's with anything, you know, and how I'm in a position where I'm really only responsible for myself. I don't have to provide for a family. So I'm in that position where I can go, well, I'm going to keep doing this until I'm not happy. And if I'm not happy, I'll stop. But I know that there's a lot of other people who don't have that privilege. Or they're like, fuck, I got to keep working or people don't eat, you know? So I don't know.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. But let's go to the other end of the spectrum. So if people were beginning to become a street performer or a stand-up, what would you say to those people?
Go for it. You know, just go for it. I think if it's something you really want to do, I think just, especially if it's something you really want, just go for it. And I think the biggest thing, I would say one of the biggest things that I've learned is if it's something you really honestly want, and genuinely really, really want. One of the biggest things that you could really learn is just not to give up. Like, I know some of the most talented people that they just gave up. They just got to a point where, like, this is too hard. I just can't, it's too much. There's too much, uncertainty, and there's too much this, and then I can't, and then this, and then it's just like, and they're just like, it's too hard. I can't take it anymore. And fair enough. They made that choice, and that's good for them. But I would say the biggest thing is tenacity of just staying in the game. Literally just staying in it is one of the biggest things. If that's what you really want, and because there might come a point where you go, I don't want this anymore. And that's a great way to look at it and go, it's time for me to acknowledge that. But if it is something that you really want, and it is something that makes you happy, I really feel that one of the biggest things you can do is just not to give up. Well, stay in the game.
You do see that, don't you? That the career of a street performer is much like a microcosm of a street performer doing a street show, where you start off the show feeling like a complete dick, but then people gather, and suddenly you think, oh, maybe I can do this. And then it gets to the middle of the show, there's lots of people there, you think it's great, and then things work, but you have to go through it feeling like a dick at the beginning to get there.
Totally. It's like anything, a lot of it is, and, I think some of the people that are the greatest at what they do, it was never easy for them. Usually the people that end up becoming, like, I would say for me, some of the stand-ups that I like the most are ones that, it never came, like, nothing came to them easy. Like they had to work a long time, really hard. They had to become undeniable before doors started opening for them. And those are ultimately, you can see it. And some of those are always going to be my favorite kind of comic, because there's just something about them that you can see that you just go, yeah, fuck it. You get to that point where it's resilience. And so I don't know. I think there's something really beautiful in that too. It's just a matter of acknowledging it and just going, yeah, it's a challenge, and it's not always going to be easy. And, but this is the path I'm on, and I'm going to double down on it. And I'm just going to keep doing it until this might happen, and it might not happen, but I'm going to go for it. And I'd rather die knowing that I went for it, as opposed to dying and thinking, fuck, I wonder what if,
Yeah, exactly that. And I'm sure over the next following weeks, a lot of people you've seen over your life will watch this and will see your words.
Yeah, who knows? I'm surprised that anyone would want to watch me. Even the dog left, Matt. The dog got bored. The dog fucked off.
But I certainly have not got bored. I found it a thoroughly entertaining, insightful, and interesting conversation.
It's been great chatting with you, Matt. I'm glad that we were able to finally make it happen, because we were I apologize just because I've been all over the place, but I'm glad that we nailed it in and got it to happen. So
it's good to hear you're busy, but I'm going to push on this again. There's lots of people you perform with for years, people who've helped you, and lots of people you mentioned have been inductees in the show and been part of the archive and a regular watch of the archive. People you've spent your life with in the street. Is there anything you want to say to them?
Fuck off. No, I'm only no. No. Who owes me money? Probably somebody does. And if I owe you money, you're not getting it. No. Yeah. No, I don't know. Most of the people that it's funny, because I do think that some of the people that I still am friends with are friends from street performing. And some people you grow out of, not that one is that you outgrow, but your relationships kind of go, don't really have anything in common with them at this moment. And, but there are some people that are still like some of my best friends that I keep in touch with. So, and I do really feel, like I said before, I'm really proud to be a street performer. I'll never feel like it's anything that I'm ashamed of or that it's beneath me. I think it's something I'm always proud of. It's given me so much. And yeah, I just think that it's such a weird thing. And we have such a funny little community. And it's like, you know, we don't always have to get along, but it is really beautiful to see sometimes when shit happens and then people do this massive fundraiser and it's like everyone rallies in together and, you know, like it's dysfunctional. It's all fucking nuts, but there's some beautiful stuff that happens in it too. I think it's like anything, you know, you don't always have to like everybody and not everybody has to get along, but it's definitely entertaining. I mean, there's some fucking whack jobs. It is funny as hell.
We're that crazy trailer park family that, you know, there's crazy people left, right, and center. We don't get on. But if someone's going to challenge the yard or if someone's getting their trailer burned down, we all pitch in and get buckets of water.
True. Do you ever get Trailer Park Boys in the UK?
Yeah, well, I got shown it by a German friend, but yes, very much so.
Yeah. I showed Trailer Park Boys to Ronnie, who's one of my best friends, you know, Ronnie Hazar. And I showed it to her a few years ago because it came on Netflix. And she was like, this is the most genius show that's ever been made. I'm like, I know. And it's like, it's basically just a bunch of street performers. You know, just they always, it starts off, they're just idiots. You know, they always start off with a plan of becoming a hero. They get so close to becoming that hero and then it all goes to shit. But it's like you're rooting for them, but they're just idiots.
They mean well. Do abhorrent things to try and make good things happen.
Totally.
Anyway, Sharon, it's been a joy. It really has been a joy to chat. I've had a really, really good time.
Likewise, Matt. And good on you for doing this. You know, it's actually pretty cool. I mean, this is your, 111th episode?
Yeah, 100.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I only have 7 episodes of my podcast. So, like, good on you. Like, this is really an ambitious project. And you've got, like, a library and an archive of this that's, like, fuck. It's impressive. Yeah, so good for you.
It's hundreds of hours now of street performers talking about their lives, which has been an absolute joy to be part of. You know, it started off thinking about what to do in COVID and just drinking a bottle of wine and chatting with people and kind of, you know, the experience you get at the end of a day where you go to a bar with the people on pitch and they share the story. It was meant to kind of replace that while COVID was going on. And it's just carried on. I can't really stop doing it now. I've enjoyed it that much. I'm going to keep going until people stop talking to me. Cool. Sharon.
It's hilarious.
Thank you, mate. You have a really, really wonderful day. Everyone who's been watching, guys, thank you for watching with us. Have a wonderful day.